Gershon Baskin does join us right now. Years of experience in this particular area, and you've heard the reports that we've heard, or maybe you know more. Anything on the hostage deal that's being worked out that you can tell us at this hour?
Look, I think it's really important to realize that those who know don't talk, and those who don't know do talk. The worst thing that happens to the families of the hostages is that their hopes are brought up and then crash the next day when nothing happens. Gilad Shalit, the Israeli soldier, was in Hamas captivity for 5 years and 4 months, told me once when I asked him what was the hardest part that he went through, he said, I had a radio and I would hear all the time that there was a deal and nothing happened. So I think it's really important that we be cautious about what we say about the negotiations that are going on. This is a very bizarre reality because Israel is trying to negotiate a deal with people that it intends to kill. Israel is not in a position to make demands. It is Hamas that's holding the hostages, and Israel can agree to the deal that's being offered or try and get a better deal, but they're really not in a position to push Hamas into a deal that it doesn't want to give. So we have a very precarious situation. Time is going by quickly. The hostages' lives are at risk every single day.
From the Israelis' point of view, you mentioned the word time. So obviously they want to get the hostages back as quickly as possible. But the other aspect of time that they seem concerned about is how long they will pause this war that they're executing in Gaza. Seems to be some thinking that if you do so for 5 days, maybe that's too much. I mean, what would you say about that and whether that might be a sticking point?
It's a ridiculous argument. 4 or 5 days, 6 days, 7 days, it doesn't matter. The war is going to continue. There is no scenario from the Israeli point of view that Hamas is left in power in Gaza. So even if they have to pause for a week, to get the hostages back is the most important thing right now. As many hostages as possible, the women, the children, the elderly, the wounded, the sick, as many as possible. There's nothing more urgent than that.
I want to ask you one big picture question before we let you go, because your experience, as I talked about when introducing you, is not only in hostage negotiation, but just in a larger working for peace. You've worked for years and years for peace in the region. The New York Times picked up on a relationship of yours inside of Gaza that might be instructive to people watching and talk about what happens maybe even after the war. The headline from it is, for years, 2 men shuttled between Israel and Hamas. The shuttled messages between Israel and Hamas, but that is no longer happening. One of those men, this New York Times piece, is you. Since 2006, Gershon Baskin, an Israeli peace activist, and Ghazi Hamad, a Hamas official, maintained a secret back channel between Gaza and Israel. Then October 7th happened. Tell us who this gentleman is and why you two are no longer speaking, and maybe what it means for what happens after the war, if anything.
Ghazi Hamad, at 2006, when Gilad Shalit was abducted by Hamas, was a spokesperson of the Hamas government and advisor to the prime minister. He was my first interlocutor after Hamas contacted me a week after Gilad Shalit was abducted. We opened up a channel of communication between the government of Israel and Hamas that led 2.5 months later to the first sign of life from Gilad Shalit and proof that there was a channel that led to the people holding him. It took another 5 years of back and forth to convince the Israeli government to authorize the secret direct back channel. That secret back channel led to the breakthrough in the negotiations that eventually led to the release of Shalit and 1,027 Palestinian prisoners. During the years after that, Ghazi Hamad and I continued our relationship. We negotiated 2 ceasefires. We tried to negotiate a long-term ceasefire. We tried to negotiate over the last 8 years the release of the bodies of 2 Israeli soldiers and 2 Israeli civilians who are alive in Gaza. We failed. Starting about 2 years ago, I had proposed that we try and meet face-to-face once again. We had done that 4 times before to try and talk about a long-term ceasefire, but he was hesitant, and I suspected it was at that time that he was involved in the beginning of the planning of the military operation, the terrorist attack that took place on October 7th. Ghazi Hamad was a person who I thought was a pragmatist. He demonstrated humanity during the years that we were in contact. He cared about the possibility of making peace. And yet before this war started, he was sent to Beirut, where he's become the spokesperson for the war for Hamas. Yeah. Initially, he denied that Hamas committed the atrocities that they did. And then finally, when he admitted it, he said, we did it, and we would do it again, again, and again, 1,000,000 times, and Israel must be annihilated. Wow. That's not the same person I knew for 17 years. And even though we started negotiation from the first day of this war to get hostages out, it was very clear that he was not only disconnected from the decision-making people in Gaza and not being in Gaza anymore, he had also changed from a humane person to someone who praised inhumanity.
Right. So you said, I know in a text you didn't want to ever speak to him again, but I think it speaks to the larger issue of how challenging not only things are now, but they will be whenever what's happening now is over. Gershon Baskin, thank you for all your years of experience and perspective. We appreciate having you on the show. Thanks so much for watching. Just go to joinnn.com to find NewsNation on your television provider. And don't forget to click the red subscribe button below to get more of NewsNation's fact-driven, unbiased coverage.